And now, marine weather around Alaska.
Welcome aboard. I'm National Weather Service Meteorologist Peter Chan with your marine weather outlook for Alaska for this weekend. Starting with the sea ice edge, there is some ice that remains up here along the Beaufort Sea coastline, the Arctic coast, particularly in the vicinity of Barrow Utqiagvik. It's within the navigational lanes here, so be aware of that. Otherwise, we do expect this ice to shift more northward with time as we go through the later weekend and into early next week. On the weather map, we have had a couple of fronts push their way, the initial front working its way east toward Kaktovik, and a secondary front working its way in through the northwest. Weak low pressure here just to the southeast of Kodiak Island, and then back to the west. There's a low out here entering the western Bering, and we're going to see a train of a few different waves of low pressure work along this front as we go through the course of the weekend. On Saturday, low pressure is out over the Gulf with some showers around it. They may brush the outer coast of the Panhandle, but this feature will also weaken in time and head more southeastward. Along this stationary front, we expect a couple of different areas of low pressure to work their way inland with more moisture. Breezier conditions here along areas of the west coast, particularly the Seward Peninsula, Norton Sound, and lower Yukon Delta. Could see water levels, higher surf 1 to 3 feet above normal, because we also have higher astronomical tide since new moon was just a couple days ago. And on Sunday, we see another wave of low pressure working its way in. This is going to spread a pretty good soaking of rain across into the interior Sunday into Sunday night. And as we transition into next week, we will start to see some lows coming up out of the North Pacific and begin to impact areas of the Southwest as we get to mid and latter part of the week ahead. But looking at the marine forecast here for the Panhandle, northwest winds 10 to 15 knots, Stevens Passage down to Dixon Entrance, south winds Lynn Canal, waves generally a couple of feet. Outer coast winds will be have a westerly component south of Sitka at 10 to 15 knots, but more of an easterly component, 15 knots there north of Gustavus and outside of Yakutat Bay, waves 5 to 6 feet. Sunday, winds generally northwest around 10 knots across the inner channels with waves running a couple of feet. For areas along the outer coast, northwest to north winds right around 20 knots with waves of 5 to 6 feet. For the northern Gulf, this area here, we're watching a special note, the Berg Glacier dammed lake is released, and there may be some debris coming into Controller Bay as a result of that. So watch out for any sort of debris, partially submerged logs or trees, or some ice chunks. And then along the Seward coastline, east winds 15 knots, east winds 10 knots, 2-foot waves in Prince William Sound. Cook Inlet, generally south-southwest winds 10 to 15 knots. Waves running anywhere from 2 to maybe as high as 4 feet there off of Anchor Point. And on Sunday, variable winds along the northwestern Gulf, only around 10 knots, waves a couple of feet. Look for southwest winds, mid-upper Cook Inlet with waves 3, maybe as high as 4 to 5 feet there, just to the west of Anchor Point. Across Kodiak Island on Saturday, variable winds 10 knots, as well as down here toward Cold Bay False Pass, waves just a couple of few feet. Winds middle Alaska Peninsula will be west to northwest 15 knots, and waves 3 to 4 feet on the North Pacific side, 3 feet on the Bering side. And Sunday, overall winds across much of the region here. Kodiak Island, the Alaska Peninsula, variable right around 10 knots, waves just running a couple of feet. On the Aleutians, Saturday we'll see variable winds 10 knots over the eastern Aleutians with waves only 2 to 3 feet, but south winds pick up to gale force west of Kiska up toward Shimei, 35 knots, waves there as high as 15 to 17 feet. Sunday, variable winds around 10 knots continue across the eastern Aleutians, waves generally running 2 to 3 feet. South winds picking up to 25 knots and turning a little more southwesterly to 25 knots west of Kiska, waves out this way running 10 to 12 feet. Along the southwestern coast, 15-knot westerly winds in Bristol Bay, south winds to 20 knots into Kuskokwim Bay and up through Toland Strait. Look for southwest winds 20 to 25 knots along the lower Yukon Delta into Norton Sound. It's a long fetch of southwesterly winds pulling moisture in areas of rain that'll continue to work their way across the west coast here this weekend. And on Sunday, winds strengthen a bit. Southwest winds 25 knots along the lower Yukon Delta and surrounding Norton Sound, especially up there into Nome. So within this area is where we expect tides and surf levels could be running 1 to 3 feet above normal during high tide. So keep that in mind. And then as we go up through the Bering Strait, southwest winds south of there 20 to 20 knots. On the Chukchi Sea side, we are looking at winds out of the west to north at 15 to 20 knots, and winds turn back toward the southeast to 20 knots, Prudhoe Bay to Kaktovik, and where there is open water, waves are generally running 3 to 4 feet. For Sunday, look for east-southeast winds along the central eastern Arctic coast, 2 to 3 foot waves. Kind of a mixed bag, southwest to south, 20-knot winds off Utqiagvik may start to help pull some of that ice a little further north, maybe out of the navigational channels. And then down here across the lower Chukchi Sea, northeast to east winds 15 knots, waves 3 feet. But once you get south of the Bering Strait, north side of St. Lawrence Island into Norton Sound, we expect winds on Sunday 20 to 25 knots from the south-southwest with waves of 4 to 6 feet.